For roughly 300,000 years, humans woke up every single day with nowhere they had to be. No job existed, no boss, no clock, no career. And somehow, in that enormous absence of obligation, our species built language, art, ritual, and the entire foundation of who we are now. That should sound impossible. Modern life runs on the assumption that structure comes from above, from a schedule, an employer, a paycheck that forces you out of bed. Remove all of that, and you'd expect chaos, or worse, nothing at all. And yet, for the overwhelming majority of human existence we're talking, roughly 95% of the time our species has been around, there was no such structure, and people did not sit around doing nothing. Agriculture is only about 12,000 years old. Formal employment, in anything close to the shape you'd recognize today, is far younger than that. So for nearly the entire run of human history, the day organized itself around something other than a job. So what actually filled it? Let's start with the myth that needs correcting first, because it's the one most people carry around without questioning it. The idea that prehistoric life was a non-stop, brutal grind, every waking hour spent clawing for survival, one bad hunt away from starvation. That image comes largely from projecting industrial-era anxieties backward onto people who lived very differently. In the 1960s, an anthropologist named Marshall Solins popularized the opposite idea that hunter-gatherer societies were, in his words, the original affluent society, working only a few hours a day to meet their needs and spending the rest of their time resting, socializing, and simply being. Solins was building on real fieldwork, most famously the research of anthropologist Richard Lee, who spent extended time living with the Juhowansi people of the Kalahari Desert, then commonly referred to by outsiders as the Kung, starting in the early 1960s. Lee's data suggested that adults in that community spent somewhere around 15 to 20 hours a week directly acquiring food, a number that quickly became one of the most quoted statistics in all of anthropology. Here's where it gets more honest, though, and more interesting than either extreme. That 15 to 20 hours number has been heavily debated since it was first published. Critics pointed out it counted only the time spent directly hunting or gathering food, not the hours spent processing that food afterward, cooking it, making and repairing tools, hauling water, or caring for children, all of which take up real time and real effort. When later researchers factored in that additional labor, total working time came out meaningfully higher in many hunter-gatherer societies, in some cases closer to 40 or more hours a week, depending on the environment, the season, and the specific group being studied. So the everyone worked a 4-hour day version of this story oversimplifies things. The numbers also weren't uniform across the globe. Groups living in resource-rich environments with reliable food sources generally logged fewer working hours than groups in harsher, more seasonal, or more marginal environments, where survival genuinely did demand more from the day. But even the more corrected estimates averaged across different environments. Land somewhere that would look surprisingly familiar to a modern person with a regular job, not the endless grind of popular imagination, and critically, without anything resembling a boss, a deadline, or a career. So if the day wasn't consumed by either nonstop survival or total leisure, what was actually happening in the hours that weren't spent gathering food? A huge amount of it, it turns out, went into something that doesn't show up if you're only counting productive labor maintenance of relationships. Anthropologists who've spent time embedded with hunter-gatherer communities consistently report enormous amounts of time spent talking. Not idle chatter active, deliberate storytelling, gossip, negotiation, and the ongoing work of managing a small, tightly interdependent social group where your survival quite literally depended on the people around you trusting you and liking you. In an environment with no police, no courts, and no written law, conversation itself was the entire justice system, reputation management system, and social safety net rolled into one. Sitting around a fire talking wasn't a break from the real work. For a highly social species, it may have been some of the most important work happening all day. Then there's skill transmission, which took up far more of daily life than a modern person might assume. Nearly everything a hunter-gatherer needed to survive: tracking animals, identifying which plants were edible and which were poisonous, making tools, reading weather patterns, navigating terrain without maps had to be taught directly, person to person, usually across years of hands-on practice starting in early childhood. There was no school building, but there was constant informal education happening throughout the day, woven into whatever task was already being done. A child wasn't sent away to learn. They learned by being present for everything. Children in particular spent an enormous amount of their day doing something that looked to an outside observer almost entirely like play, and in a very real sense, it was. Miniature bows, digging sticks, and carrying slings sized for small hands show up across the ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer societies. And anthropologists who've observed children in these communities consistently describe a pattern of learning through direct participation rather than formal instruction. Children tagging along on gathering trips, mimicking adult tasks in play, being handed small responsibilities well before they were technically needed, and absorbing an enormous amount of practical knowledge simply by being present in an adult world that never really excluded them. There was no artificial separation between child time and adult time the way a modern school day creates. A child's entire day was in effect a long apprenticeship disguised as living. Rest itself is trickier than the popular version of this story suggests, and worth getting right rather than romanticizing it. When sleep researcher Jerome Siegel and colleagues studied the Hadza, San, and Tsimane using wearable sleep trackers, the results actually undercut the assumption that pre-industrial people rested more total nightly sleep came out to roughly 5.7 to 7. 1 hours on average, similar to or even slightly less than typical modern sleep, and napping showed up as fairly infrequent rather than a built-in daily ritual. A later, Hadza-specific study did find a more flexible pattern, with naps occurring on a little over half of days, shaped by temperature and activity rather than a fixed schedule. What holds up across this research isn't that ancient rest was longer or more indulgent, it's that it wasn't scheduled around anyone else's demands. There was no employer deciding when downtime was allowed to happen. And then there's the category that might be the hardest for a modern mind to fully take seriously: play, ritual, and art, which occupied real, protected time rather than being treated as a reward for finishing real work first. Body decoration, music, dance, storytelling with no practical purpose beyond the story itself, elaborate rituals around birth, death, and the changing seasons. These weren't rare indulgences. Archaeological evidence, including cave paintings tens of thousands of years old and ornamental objects with no survival function whatsoever, suggests that a meaningful chunk of daily and seasonal time across early human history was devoted to activity that produced nothing except meaning. There's also a structural reason all of this free time existed in the first place. And it has less to do with laziness or abundance than with how these societies chose to organize themselves. The anthropologist James Woodburn, who spent years studying the Hadza of Tanzania, described most mobile hunter-gatherer groups as immediate return societies, meaning food was typically eaten within a day or two of being acquired, rather than stored, hoarded, or accumulated for later. Nobody was working extra hours to build up a surplus, because a surplus wasn't really the goal. What was shared today didn't need guarding tomorrow. That single structural choice, eat it now, share it now, don't stockpile, removed an entire category of labor that shows up constantly in more developed economies: the work of protecting, managing, and fighting over accumulated wealth. Woodburn also documented that these societies were often fiercely, deliberately egalitarian, actively enforcing norms that prevented any one person from gaining outsized status, power, or possessions. Without a hierarchy to maintain, and without stockpiles to defend, there was simply less for the social system to spend its labor on. It's a strange thought experiment. A huge amount of what fills a modern workweek administration, security, management, the entire apparatus of protecting and organizing accumulated resources may not be an inevitable feature of being human. It may be a side effect of deciding to accumulate in the first place. Which brings us to the actual point. The one that should make you a little uncomfortable if you've internalized the modern assumption that time only counts if it's spent producing something. For nearly the entire span of human existence, there was no separation between work and life, because there was no job to separate life from. There was simply the day, a mix of subsistence tasks, social maintenance, teaching, rest, and meaning making, blended together without hard boundaries, without someone else deciding how your hours would be spent. The 40-hour work week, the idea of clocking in, the entire concept of selling your time to someone else in exchange for money, none of that is ancient. It's a genuinely recent invention, arriving with agriculture, then intensifying dramatically with industrialization. compressed into roughly the last few hundred years out of a 300,000-year story. That timeline should reframe something. The modern feeling that unstructured time is uncomfortable, that a free afternoon with nothing scheduled produces anxiety instead of relief, isn't some deep truth about human nature. It's a learned response to a genuinely new way of living, one your species has occupied for a rounding error of its total existence. For most of the time humans have existed, an empty afternoon wasn't a problem to be solved. It was simply what almost every afternoon looked like. There's a harder question sitting underneath all of this, though, and it's worth sitting with instead of resolving too neatly. The hunter-gatherer version of no job also came without the safety net, the medicine, and the long-term security that structured modern economies eventually provided. Infant mortality was high. A bad season could be genuinely dangerous. Nobody is arguing that a return to constant physical vulnerability is the trade worth making. It's not that ancient life was simply better and modern life is simply worse. It's that humans built an entirely different relationship with time than the one you're currently living inside of. And for the vast majority of the species' history, that relationship didn't include the specific kind of obligation you probably felt when you woke up this morning. It also helps explain something that might otherwise look like a coincidence. The sheer amount of modern energy currently being spent trying to recreate, on weekends and vacations and retirement plans, the exact ingredients that used to just be Tuesday. Long, unhurried conversation. Time with no productivity attached to it. Skills learned for their own sake instead of for a resume. None of that had to be scheduled or protected 40,000 years ago, because there was no competing structure demanding the hours instead. The fact that so much modern effort now goes into carving out small pockets of that original, unstructured way of living suggests it was never a lesser way to spend a life. It may have simply been the default one, before something else came along and started charging rent on your hours. So when you picture that day, 40,000 years ago, with nobody rushing anywhere it wasn't empty, it was full of exactly the things a job now crowds out. Long conversation, patient teaching, real rest, and time spent making things that served no purpose except being beautiful. The strange part isn't that they filled their time without a job. The strange part is how much of what filled it looks like the things you're still chasing on your days off. If you could genuinely trade your job for that version of a day full, unhurried, and entirely your own, would you actually take it? Let me know what you think in the comments. See you in the next one.